Shalom and welcome back to the Rashi Nosh. I'm Pastor Matt.
And I'm Kara.
Thank you for joining with us as we get together each week at this time and share something from the Torah portion. And honey, I'd like to ask you if you would like to talk about feet. This week's Torah portion is called Eikev, and Eikev means heel. And this is interesting because Eikev sort of sounds like Yaakov, or maybe a little similar, because this is where Jacob gets his name. You see, Jacob is connected to the word heel. He was grabbing the heel, exactly. So that's why he's named this. Jacob or Yaakov is related to Eikev, which means heel. And that's this week's Torah portion. Now, Rashi says something very interesting about why this Torah portion is called Eikev. And let me just read this to you. This is from Deuteronomy 7:12. And it shall come to pass because you listen to these ordinances. Here's what's interesting. This word Eikev can also be translated as because. But it literally has this connotation of heel. So why does this Torah portion, why do we think that it has something to do with a heel? Well, here's what Rashi says, and I want to get your thoughts on this. Rashi interprets the word Eikev, which literally means heel, as referring to minor commandments that people tend to trample underfoot. Minor commandments that people tend to put under their heel, that we tend to step on or regard as less significant. He explains that the Torah promises blessings not only for observing major commandments, but also for paying attention to the less obvious or minor ones. This teaches us the importance of valuing all aspects of the Torah equally, not just the commandments that we perceive as more significant. Now, there's a teaching in Judaism that when it comes from the Torah, there's a commandment to shoo away a mother bird if we're going to take the eggs, to not distress the mother bird by shooing it away from the nest if we're going to take the eggs. And there is a lesson that is taught that says shooing away the mother bird actually has the same promise of blessing as honor your father and mother. You know that you'll have a long life in the land. It's a commandment with a promise. So since the reward for shooing away the mother bird is the same as honoring your father and mother, Judaism teaches that we should regard a minor commandment with just as much importance as a major commandment because we don't know what the reward will be for doing the minor commandment. Now, what's interesting is, at least in English, in today's world, there is an expression, a figure of speech that people use that if something is less desirable or not as important or disregarded, it is said to be stepped on. Something that is not as good a quality as something else, it's said to be, well, this thing is stepped on. In other words, it's underfoot. It is something that you would just walk all over. And that's basically what Rashi is saying about these types of commandments. Obviously, there are commandments that we think are giant. Don't commit murder. That seems like a giant one. But I really think that smaller commandments that we sometimes trample on, like love your neighbor as yourself, are just as important. We might think, well, I'm not violating a giant commandment. I'm not murdering anyone. I'm not stealing anything. But when we disregard people in our lives and don't love them as we love ourselves, we are just as much violating a commandment of the Torah as if we are doing something major. So do you think that there is an importance, or how do you feel about this idea of if we do well in the small commandments, that we're probably going to be looking after the larger ones?
Yeah, makes me think of the saying how, all the commandments can be boiled down into love God and love others, So if you love others, then you're not going to steal, you're not going to murder, you're not going to do all that stuff.
Yes.
And it's definitely easier to do and focus on the the negative commands, like don't do this, don't do this. But sometimes you forget all the stuff that you should do, like the positive. Sometimes it's hard to remember to do those things, more of the mitzvah type things, as opposed to just trying to avoid all the big no-nos, you know?
Right. Well, and even some of the commandments that seem rather big, I think the older we get, they break down into smaller things, like as our parents age, honor your father and your mother. I think doing little things for our parents as they get older, I think is really a big deal.
Yeah.
You know, I watched as my parents really looked after my grandmother who passed away a few years ago. She was over 100 years old, but she was still living at home and living on her own. She was very independent. She didn't want to be a bother or a burden to anyone. And I know you would go over periodically and clean her apartment. And she still was cooking for herself and doing her own laundry and all of this stuff. But the little things that my dad would do, for instance, her doctor said she needed to eat more protein. She wasn't having enough protein. And I remember my dad buying her little steaks and making little steaks for her so that she would have meat in her diet, so that she would have enough protein. My grandmother, we called her Granny. She grew up during a time in the United States called the Great Depression, a really bad economic time where they had to eat whatever scraps they could find. And so she was accustomed to eating things like lettuce that doesn't have many calories at all, if any. And so my dad, wanting to take care of her, you know, she didn't want to live with my parents or be in some sort of residential facility or whatever. In fact, the only reason why the last couple of her weeks of her life, the only reason she lived in a facility, she fell and injured herself. So to me, when you think of when you're a kid, when you think of honor your father and your mother, it seems like a very big thing. You need to respect them and obey them. But the older they get, honor your father and mother could become one of those heel type commandments that you trample on. It could be very easy for people to ignore someone as they get older or to not take care of them
in their life day to day anymore because you don't live under the same roof. Yeah.
Right. And that's a wonderful point. You know, the older we get independent. We're not with our parents all the time. But I think some of these commandments that seem big can become little day-to-day. Are we really checking in with our family members or maybe friends that have moved away? Loving our neighbor as ourselves, that seems like something that we can trample on because we seem so focused on and consumed with, like you said, those big, major commandments. But I remember Yeshua saying in the New Testament, you know, you cross the sea to get one commandment, or sorry, one convert. You cross the ocean to get one convert, or you try to strain out the gnat, but you swallow a camel. But you're ignoring the weightier things of the Torah, like justice and mercy. You know, these are things that could be trampled underfoot, and we need to maybe pay attention to those little commandments. You know, the little ones are just as important as the big ones, and so let's make sure that we're doing that. Let's make sure that we are loving our neighbor the way that we love ourselves. Let's make sure that we are taking care of those of our friends and family that are maybe getting a little older. It's a Jewish concept that if you have a limited amount of food and you have an animal, that you feed your animal first. That's actually a Jewish concept. These tiny things, little acts of love and care and concern, escorting someone, helping them get into a building or get out of their vehicle, little things like that are there. It's still a mitzvah, even though it seems very small. So I think our advice to our viewers this week should be that they pay attention, that they do something small, that they do a little mitzvah, a little act of kindness, something that you might think is just a small thing that might go under your heel. But let's pay attention during Parashat Eikev to those smaller commandments. See what doing a small mitzvah in someone's life, see how it can make a big difference in their day. So, anything else on that?
No. I mean, I feel like just like if you're trying to become more and more um, holy, and starting with the smaller is almost makes more sense. You know what I mean? They're more attainable.
Right.
And so then you build, and then those become second nature, and then you add more, and then you add more. So it's almost in the search for righteousness. You know what I mean? It would make sense to focus more on the small that are more attainable. But we tend to do the opposite.
Right. That's very curious. So do you think maybe it's possible for us to look at some of these small things and maybe make them habits in our life to where they become second nature? That's very good advice. That's very good advice for us this week, to start small. Start small with some of these small mitzvot and make them part of our habit. It's been said that it only takes about 3 weeks to create a new habit in your life. Some of us maybe have some habits that we want to try to get rid of. Maybe we have some negative habits, some bad habits. And maybe it would be good for us to try to get rid of some of those bad habits and add some new good habits, some positive things that we can do. So this week, pay attention to your heel. Pay attention to those things that might go underfoot, and to treat them with the same importance as what we might consider large commandments. Thank you so much for joining us. We pray that this has been a blessing to you, and we are praying for you no matter where you are in the world. May God bless you and give your family shalom.